All right, here we are. We are at the end of week 2, and I wanted to take some time today just to kind of lead up to the end of the beginning of World War II. And that involves the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brings the United States into the war officially. Mr. Osborne, Fairview High School, this is spring 2020. And a little bit of background. The United States was a key trading partner of the Empire of Japan for copper, oil, other pieces of technology that Japan was not able to produce itself. And after the Nanjing Massacre, the relationship with Japan and the West, including Great Britain, France, and the United States, begins to sour a little bit because that is not something that that's not the behavior that the West would condone. But the trade is still active. People enjoy making money. In 1940, so the war in Europe starts in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. In 1940, Japan invades French-controlled Indochina, which is kind of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The U.S. stopped selling war supplies and aviation fuel to Japan in response to that. But they still trade on oil, they still trade copper, and other kind of necessary materials for the Japanese economy. In September of 1940, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact, which forms the Axis powers in World War II. So Japan's goal during World War II is essentially to establish an Asian empire that was ruled by Asians. And the key piece that needed to happen is that they needed to invade and fully control all of China. But in order to defeat China, they needed their own secure sources of oil. They had a very large navy, they're an island nation, and at the time, all those vessels, all those ships consumed oil in order to move, right? They need their diesel fuel. And there was a supply of oil in East Asia, and that was at the time it was known as the Dutch East Indies. Today it's known as Indonesia. They had a lot of oil. Between Japan and modern-day Indonesia, though, you had the U.S. controlled the Philippines. Okay, and so, Great Britain also maintained a sizable navy presence in Southeast Asia due to its colonial land holdings. So all those things kind of factored into things that were in the way of Japan establishing its Asian empire, Pacific Asian empire. So in 1941 is when things really start ramping up between Japan and the United States. So France ends up falling to Nazi Germany. We'll be talking about that next week in the war in Europe. And kind of in response to that, the U.S. decides to cut off all oil trade. They put Japan under an oil embargo in kind of the spring, early summer of 1941. By October, the Empire of Japan and the United States start having these kind of peace talks. They're not at war, but they want to reestablish the positive relations, especially the trading relationship that they had had before everything kind of went sideways with World War II in Europe. And Japan had a few kind of demands, if you will, in these peace talks to reestablish relationship. They wanted the U.S. to lift its oil embargo and also to stop supporting the Chinese war effort. The United States was supplying the national government of China with airplanes, tanks, and other weapons in support of their effort to defeat Japanese aggression, but also to defeat Chinese communist aggression, but that's a story for a different day. The U.S. wanted Japan to stop expansion in Asia. You know, they basically saw the ambition of Japan and they wanted them to stop that expansion because the Asian Pacific region was generally kind of seen under this larger sphere of influence of the United States. The breakdown of those talks happens essentially when the Japanese side requests that President Roosevelt meet with the Prime Minister Konoye of Japan, but Roosevelt says that there needs to be a treaty in place before he agrees to meet the Prime Minister. Resulting in November 26th, the Japanese Naval Task Force with aircraft carriers, they set sail for Hawaii. December 7th, 1941, just before 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, the Japanese launched the first wave of attacks on Pearl Harbor. The aircraft come in three waves, the three different groups. The first group was mostly these heavy bombers. They're still launching from aircraft carriers, so they're not like the super, B-17 type bombers. But instead, they just had one large bomb that each aircraft carried. You also had torpedo bombers, which carried large torpedoes that they would drop in close proximity, and they would hit the sides of the ships. Dive bombers, and eventually, kind of in that last third group, they had fighters to kind of have support and eliminate the American air response, should there be any. The main targets were the battleships and the airfields in Pearl Harbor. The second wave follows, also has three groups, but their main targets are the airfields and just any other target of opportunity within Pearl Harbor. By 9:30 in the morning, the attack was over. It lasted approximately 90 minutes, and Japan never returns again to attack Hawaiian Islands. All right, a third wave was actually proposed, and that was going to target the fuel and munitions reserves, but Japan instead withdrew and returned to the home islands. The casualties and losses of the attack on Pearl Harbor were very, very much lopsided, and it demonstrated the power that an aircraft carrier that could launch hundreds of aircraft had over traditional naval combat. So the totals ended up being 2,335 Americans killed, 1,143 wounded, nearly 190 aircraft were destroyed, nearly 160 aircraft were damaged, 4 battleships were sunk, and 2 of them were not returned to service. The Arizona still is in Pearl Harbor under the ocean as kind of a memorial graveyard to all those sailors lost. 4 more battleships were damaged, and 9 other ships in Pearl Harbor were damaged. On the Empire of Japan side, only 64 soldiers were killed. 1 was captured, 29 aircraft were destroyed, 74 aircraft were damaged, and 5 of these miniature micro submarines were lost. That was all the losses that Japan suffered. It was a surprise attack. There was no warning. There was no declaration of war beforehand. And the end result was quite devastating to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. However, it also had a very large impact on the war as a whole, because December 8th, the very next day, the United States Congress declares war on Japan. It had been neutral up until December 8th, 1941. It hadn't chosen a side yet, even though it was supporting the Allied powers, Great Britain and France. December 11th, later that week, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States, and the United States in return declares war on Germany and Italy. The other thing I want to mention is that this also wakes up the American military-industrial complex. Japan's Navy had 12 battleships during World War II. The United States Navy started off with 17 battleships in 1941, split between both the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, and then by 1945 it was up to 23. Fleet carriers, Japan started with 15, and the United States started with only 7, but by the end of the war had 28. Support carriers, so slightly smaller in size, Japan started with 10. USA had 1 support carrier in 1941. By the end of the war, 1945, it had 71. All right, massive industrial capacity from the United States was activated as a result of the aggression on December 7th on Pearl Harbor from the Empire of Japan. So here's my question. Here's the assignment to kind of wrap up the things this week. Why did Japan join the Axis powers in World War II? I want you to kind of think about this a little bit. Don't take like the surface level answer. What I'm looking for is 100 to 250 words, 1 to 3 paragraphs, very short assignment, and I just want you to answer that question. Why did Japan join Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy during World War II? But you also need to make sure that you address what benefits were there for Japan when what benefits were there for Germany. Right? Everyone that joins an alliance together, they have to have a reason or an incentive to allow for this to happen. So that is your summative assignment for this week. Good luck, and that's your summary assignment for this week. We'll see you guys next week.